You know the story. A white whale, a captain's obsession. The greatest novel America ever wrote. What you probably don't know is that it really happened. Not a whale hunting one man, a whale hunting a whole ship and winning. In 1820, a sperm whale attacked and sank an American whaling ship on purpose, 2,000 miles from land. 20 men escaped in 3 small boats. Herman Melville turned what came next into a novel because the truth was too dark to sell. This is the real story of the whaleship Essex, and it is worse than the book. To understand the Essex, you have to understand Nantucket. In 1819, this small island off the coast of Massachusetts was the whaling capital of the world. Whale oil lit the lamps of America and Europe, and Nantucket's men chased it to the far side of the planet. The Essex was old, small, and thought to be lucky. Her new captain, George Pollard Jr., was 28 on his very first command. His first mate, Owen Chase, was young, hard, and ambitious. Among the crew of 21 were a 14-year-old cabin boy named Thomas Nickerson on his first voyage, and a teenager named Owen Coffin, the captain's own young cousin. Remember both of them. On the 12th of August, 1819, the Essex set out on what was meant to be a 2.5-year voyage. It took them 5 brutal weeks just to fight their way around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America. But beyond it lay the richest whaling grounds on Earth, and slowly the ship filled her hold with oil. Then they stopped in the Galapagos Islands to load the strangest supply in whaling: giant tortoises. These animals could live for months in the dark of the hold with no food and no water. Fresh meat that kept itself alive. The men carried about 300 of them aboard, tipping the huge, slow creatures onto their shells and hauling them down one by one. On one of the islands, a crewman set a fire as a prank in the dry season. It roared out of control, swept across the whole island, and nearly trapped the men who had to run through the flames to escape. It killed off much of the island's wildlife. Within a year, these same men would be starving, haunted by every bit of food they had ever wasted. From the Galapagos, they sailed to a lonely patch of sea that whalers called the offshore ground, near the equator, about 2,000 miles from any coast. It was the most cut-off place they could possibly be. And it was there, on the 20th of November, 1820, that the whales found them. The morning of the 20th started like any other hunt. Around 8 o'clock, the lookout cried out that he'd seen spouts, and all 3 whaleboats were lowered and rowed hard after a group of sperm whales. First mate Owen Chase's boat struck one, and the whale's tail smashed a hole clean through the hull. Chase had to cut the line and row back to the Essex to nail a scrap of canvas over the damage. That small accident is the only reason he was standing on deck for what happened next. As he worked, Chase saw a huge bull sperm whale come up about 100 yards off. A giant, dark gray animal. Not white, just far bigger than the whales they hunted. He guessed it was 85 feet long, and it wasn't running away. It lay on the surface, spouted a few times, and seemed to watch the ship. Then it went under. Seconds later, it came up again, moving straight at the Essex and rammed her head on. The blow stopped the ship dead and threw the whole crew off their feet. Chase said the ship shook like a leaf. The whale passed underneath, came up on the far side, and lay there snapping its jaws and thrashing as if shaking with rage. Chase grabbed a harpoon and took aim, then stopped. The whale was right next to the rudder, the part that steered the ship. If he wounded it and it wrecked their steering, they were finished anyway. So he held back. It was a choice he would question for the rest of his life. Then the whale did the thing no whaler had ever heard of. It swam off a few hundred yards, turned to face the front of the ship head on, and charged again. This time, Chase thought, at twice the speed, pushing a wall of white water ahead of its enormous head. He wrote that it came with tenfold fury and vengeance. The second hit shattered the front of the ship. The whale drove clean underneath, disappeared, and was never seen again. The Essex rolled onto her side within minutes. The men had almost no time. They cut away the masts, chopped into the hull, and dragged out whatever would decide their fate. About 600 pounds of hard bread, casks of fresh water, navigation tools, a musket, and a few of the tortoises. For 200 years, people have asked the same question. Why would a whale do this? Chase and his men were sure of the answer. Revenge. To them, the whale had attacked to punish them for hunting its kind. Modern scientists see it differently. Sperm whales are among the smartest animals alive, the largest brain of any creature on Earth, and they live in close family groups. The leading idea is that the whale was provoked. The sound of Chase hammering on the hull may have sounded like the clicks of a rival male, and the bull charged to drive off what it thought was an intruder. Not a monster out for revenge, just a huge, intelligent animal defending its own. But that question was for later. Right then, 20 men pointed 3 small, open boats at the horizon, 2,000 miles from land, with a decision ahead of them that would kill most of them. The nearest land was actually close. The Marquesas and Society Islands were only about 1,200 miles away, with the wind at their backs. They could have reached them in a couple of weeks. But the crew had heard those islands were full of cannibals, so they made the decision that doomed them. Instead of the closer islands, they would sail more than 2,000 miles to South America, straight into the wind and the current. To avoid being eaten, they chose the route most likely to starve them to death. It is one of the cruelest twists of fate in the history of the sea. They rationed the food as tightly as they dared. Each man got a small biscuit of hard bread and a few mouthfuls of water a day. It was nowhere near enough, and the bread was so salty from the sea that it left them even thirstier. Under the tropical sun, their bodies began to shut down. After nearly a month adrift, they saw land, a low green island. They didn't even know its name. It was Henderson Island, empty of people in the middle of nowhere. They landed and searched all over it for water and had almost given up when someone found a tiny freshwater spring hidden in the rocks near the shore, one you could only reach at low tide. The island had never learned to fear people. The birds let the men walk right up and pick them up by hand. There were eggs, crabs, fish, and wild greens. For the first time in weeks, they actually ate, but 17 starving men strip a small island fast. Within about a week, the easy food was almost gone. And then they found a cave with human skeletons inside. Castaways from some earlier disaster who had come ashore exactly like this and never left. The men were looking at their own likely future. 3 of the crew decided they would rather take their chances on the island than get back in the boats. They stayed behind, and it saved their lives. They were rescued about 4 months later. The rest of the men pushed off and sailed on into open ocean. Storms tore the little group of boats apart. Then the men began to die, the weakest first, then the youngest. At first, the survivors did what sailors had always done and buried their dead at sea. Then the hunger reached a point where they could no longer afford to. When the next man died, they did not bury him. Out of food and out of time, the survivors made the choice that would haunt every one of them who lived. They used the bodies of the dead to keep the living alive. It bought them a few more days, but the bodies ran out faster than the ocean did. In Captain Pollard's boat, 4 men were still alive, with no food left and no bodies remaining. And so they came to the last, unthinkable step. They agreed to draw lots, to choose which one of them would die so the others might live. They tore up paper, drew, and the black lot fell to Owen Coffin, the captain's own teenage cousin. Pollard had promised the boy's mother he would keep him safe. He offered to take Coffin's place. He begged to stop the whole thing. Coffin refused. "I like my lot as well as any other," he's said to have answered. A second draw decided who would carry it out. A moment later, it was done. Pollard would never speak of the details for the rest of his life, and he never got over it. By late February 1821, more than 3 months after the whale, only a handful of men were still alive across the scattered boats, drifting in and out of consciousness, kept going by the bones of the friends they had lost. On the 18th of February, a passing British ship called the Indian spotted Owen Chase's boat and pulled 3 living skeletons out of it, including the cabin boy, Thomas Nickerson. 5 days later, the Nantucket whaleship Dauphin found Captain Pollard's boat. The crew looked down and saw 2 men so far gone they barely reacted to being saved, still holding the bones of their dead shipmates, unwilling to let them go. Of the 20 men who had climbed into those boats, 8 came home. They had been adrift for about 95 days. Nantucket, a town built entirely on the sea, went almost silent. Captain Pollard went back out, wrecked his next ship on a reef, and never commanded again. He lived out his days as the town's night watchman. And every year, on the anniversary, he locked himself in his room and went without food for the men he had lost. Owen Chase became a successful captain, but late in life he was found hiding food in the attic of his house, still starving in his mind, decades after the boats. Years later, a young sailor named Herman Melville was on a whaling voyage of his own when someone handed him a small book, Owen Chase's own account of the Essex disaster. Melville was electrified. He later met Captain Pollard in person and called him one of the most impressive men he had ever known. Not despite what happened, but because of how quietly he carried it. In 1851, Melville published Moby Dick. Its ending, a giant whale ramming and sinking a ship on purpose, is taken almost straight from what happened to the Essex. But Melville gave his whale one thing the real one never had, the color white. The Essex whale was an ordinary dark gray bull, just impossibly large. The idea of a monstrous white whale came from a different sea legend of the time, a real pale-skinned sperm whale that sailors called Mocha Dick, said to have survived dozens of hunts off the coast of Chile. Melville blended the two together. Mocha Dick's color and the Essex's attack became one unforgettable monster. But here's what most people never realize. Moby Dick ends almost exactly where the real story's worst chapter begins. The novel closes as the ship sinks. For the real men of the Essex, the sinking was day 1 of 3 months of thirst, storms, and choices no novel dared to show. Melville knew the ending. He chose not to write it. And for over 100 years, the fullest account of it stayed hidden. The cabin boy, Thomas Nickerson, wrote down everything he remembered, and his manuscript was lost. It was only rediscovered in 1960 and finally published more than 150 years after the voyage. We remember the myth, the white whale, the mad captain, the great American novel. But the men it was built on were real. They were braver and more broken than anything Melville ever invented, and the ocean that did this to them is still out there. These were the real men of the whaleship Essex. This is the channel They Were Real, where we bring true, forgotten history back to life. Subscribe, and we'll tell you another story.